Today on Tiny Voices, I argue for why crunch is a practice that does more harm than good. That and more today on Tiny Voices. In 2004, an anonymous LiveJournal post from a user going by the name EA Spouse ignited a debate about harsh industry working conditions and unpaid overtime. Her story compared working at EA to being in jail. This anonymous account galvanized other spouses of EA software engineers, and 2 class action lawsuits were brought against EA, which were then settled for about $15 million apiece. Based upon the Fair Labor Standards Act, even salaried employees can be eligible for overtime. EA defended itself at the time, claiming the practice of unpaid overtime during lengthy crunch periods was both necessary and fair. EA saw their business as an entrepreneurial effort, deserving of not having to pay out overtime to their salaried employees. It's easy to go for the cheap shot at EA here, given their reputation, but the truth is, EA was just the poster child for a widespread industry practice. I'll give you another example. In the closing months of 2013, with the launch of the Xbox One looming, Crytek was hard at work on Ryse, Son of Rome, a major exclusive that would launch with the Xbox One, and they hoped to get hardware flying off the shelves. Crytek's marketing and social media team launched a hashtag campaign that gave some insight into Ryse's development. The hashtag was RyseFacts, and one of those facts backfired on them. Quote, "By the time Ryse ships for the Xbox One, we will have served the crunching team more than 11,500 dinners throughout development." End quote. They were criticized for flaunting and celebrating the practice of crunch. And crunch, to be specific, is a prevailing custom in not just the game industry, but many adjacent industries of demanding employees work long stretches of uncompensated overtime. Crunch can last weeks, or it can last months. Crunch can mean going from 40 to 50-hour work weeks to 80 or upwards of 100. Stress reaches a boiling point, and compensation for all of this overtime is non-existent. Crunch is an ugly truth in the game industry. According to a survey put out by the International Game Developers Association, nearly 40% of crunch overtime went uncompensated, according to developers. 81% of developers have crunched to get a project done in the past 2 years. 50% said that it was normal. It was the status quo. It was what was expected of them. Crunch is an ugly truth in the game industry, and sometimes we're forced to face it because it rears its head from time to time. It reared its head in 2004 in the case of EA Spouse. It reared its head in 2013 as part of the backlash to RyseFacts, and it reared its head again earlier this week when Alex St. John, creator of DirectX, wrote a series of blog posts decrying the culture of victimhood propped up by so-called wage slaves complaining about the negative effects of crunch and wanting to be fairly and properly compensated for the hours they work. He refers to these people as whiners. He says passion for making games should be enough of a motivator, and he scoffs at the idea that 100-hour work weeks for months on end can be strenuous for just pushing a mouse around. Those are the clip notes. His viewpoints are troubling at times. For instance, there's this passage. Quote, "They ran about the value of work-life balance, how hit games can be delivered on a schedule with proper management, and how they can't produce their best work when their creative energies are tapped after a long 40-hour work week. Sitting at a desk. Apparently, people can even burn out working too hard to make video games." Those remarks are extraordinarily hypocritical given his own circumstances. Information technology leaders interviewed St. John in the mid to late 2000s. From the article, quote, "St. John started to burn out. He would pass out at his keyboard and straggle into morning meetings with key marks on his face. Work sucked everything out of him. His marriage disintegrated. In 1997, he succeeded in getting himself fired, as he tells it, and he, quote, walked out of Microsoft feeling 100 pounds lighter," end quote. St. John suffered the obvious human cost of extended periods of crunch developing software. It didn't matter that he was smart or talented or passionate. He burned out. As much as he scoffs at the idea of burnout now, it's a fact that can't be ignored. There are two troubling sides to this. There is both a human cost to crunch and an economic cost. In February of 2011, Jason Schreier of Kotaku published an article featuring an anecdote from one Jessica Chavez, an employee of Xseed. Chavez had worked 14 hours a day for 6 days out of the week for 9 months on one project. The story told in the article is that her workload was so intense and the stress so great that she dropped 10% of her body weight. At 5'4", she was just 99 pounds. That is not healthy. When crunch is the status quo, adverse health effects are right around the corner. Sleep disturbances, depression, fatigue, CTS, RSI, herniated lumbar discs, increased risk of stroke, and heart disease due to elevated stress. These are not minor issues. And even if you ignore the human cost of crunch, there's still the economic cost. Doubling a work week from 40 hours to 80 doesn't necessarily double the output from the worker. Imagine for a second Tom. Tom is a programmer. He's overworked. His sleep is disturbed due to the stress he's under. His nerves are frayed. He's burned out. Because he isn't sleeping right, it's affecting his concentration at work. His focus lapses while he's coding. This results in a bug popping up, a bug that wouldn't ordinarily be there. This is an extra bug that the quality assurance testers have to test for. They first have to find it, they log it, they report it. Tom has to identify where he made his mistake by poring over the code he's already written and fix the bug his lapsed focus caused. The updated build has to go out to QA, who have to retest the section in question to make sure the bug actually was fixed. That's time and money wasted for nothing. Yes, bugs aren't going to go away, but extra bugs are being created during this stressful cycle of crunch. And in general, not just with this one scenario that I've created, in general, productivity drops during prolonged crunch. There is a proverbial mountain of evidence saying that prolonged periods of crunch hurts productivity, and we should, if anything, be trending towards shorter work weeks. In fact, if you printed every single page of every peer-reviewed piece of research on the topic, you could probably build an actual mountain out of the pages. One particular statistic from a post on The Economist struck me. The average Greek work week will total up to about 2,000 hours a year. Whereas if you take the average German work week and total it up, you'll come out to about 1,400 hours a year. And yet Germans are about 70% more productive. Now, you could probably point to a whole host of factors. That itself is not a comprehensive argument in favor of shorter work weeks, but it is an illustrative example of the fact that more hours spent at work does not actually correlate well to increased productivity. If you want to do some reading, there are plenty of peer-reviewed studies in the description under the sources section, including a very insightful meta-analysis conducted by the Journal of Occupational and Organizational Psychology. I'll let you guess what they all conclude. And if it's so bad, why is this practice still so normal? I can't speak from experience or with authority on this point. I've heard arguments ranging from it being the result of poor management. I've seen it argue that it's a short-term cost-cutting measure as studios push employees to hit milestones and release windows faster, and I've read that it's the result of the intensely competitive market. Regardless of the why, what's clear is that overworked employees are damaging on all fronts. Everything takes a hit. The employees suffer from poorer physical and mental health. The companies for whom they're working ultimately get less happy, less productive employees, and increased turnover, which translates to burning money having to train employees to fill the void left by ex-employees who simply burned out. Crunch is an ugly truth in the game industry that we don't often have to confront. We know it happens, but we get the luxury of ignoring it most of the time. It's not that different from how a lot of industries operate. We know where our phones were built, where the minerals essential to our electronics were sourced, and what kind of labor goes into shipping the games that we enjoy. It's not a secret, but we don't speak about this stuff often. We don't talk about it, because if we did, we'd have to resolve some really serious cognitive dissonance that would interfere with our first world conveniences and luxuries. Tim Cook doesn't come out and say, those Foxconn employees should be grateful to even have jobs. If they were truly passionate about assembling iPhones, they wouldn't be complaining about working conditions. Because he would be rightfully raked across the coals. But if he did say that, well, it would certainly drum up a conversation that would make a lot of people uncomfortable. It would expose the elephant in the room and force everyone to pay attention to it. Whether he intended to or not, Alex St. John is forcing us to confront the elephant in the room.